Hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome back to True Crime and Wine. If you're new here, hi, hello, welcome. I am Sherilyn, and I'm so glad you found me. If you're not new here, welcome back. Thank you for joining me every single upload. You already know I love and I appreciate you so much. I'm dying right now because I just didn't even put this together, but I posted the video on my Instagram of all the Backstreet Boys, except for Kevin, rejecting me. Now I'm wearing my t-shirt from the concert. So if you guys saw that, I hope my embarrassment gave you a good chuckle. We are back filming in my bedroom again because I am revamping the studio. I'm actually relocating it out of the house. And you guys liked to have a little bit of a switch up last time, so I was like, okay, well, we'll stick with it. The only problem is that on this side I'm using natural light because my lights are elsewhere, so I only have one. And also we are fighting with the sounds that are coming right out of my window because we're on a main road right here, so lots of car noises. I'm sorry for that. Lots of barking, and you might hear little whimpering and like sniffles. We got a new puppy, so he's hanging with me today right beside me. He makes all the cute little noises. All right, enough of the updates. We're gonna get right into it. Before we do, I have a quick message for you. Before we get started, I want to give a huge thank you to one of my favorite sponsors, Scentbird. Who doesn't love getting new perfumes sent to them? I feel like scent is so important in somebody's life, and regardless of whether you have like a really great experience or like not such a great experience, it's very powerful scents. For the most part, I feel like I pretty much have, my likes dialed in. But I realized this month I'm kind of all over the board with the likes. So here's the story. One of the scents I went with was from Confessions of a Rebel, and the scent is called Bitch Please. And I went with it because I don't think that I'm a very floral or fruity liking perfume scenting person. I hope that made sense to you all. I know that it does because you guys get me. So I tend to gravitate to, musky scents. This one had sandalwood notes, so I was definitely on board. And it nailed the description. I mean, I like this scent a lot. But what I was really surprised about this month is I don't remember choosing this one, which is Ruby Rush by Paris Hilton. And this was the most unexpected surprise of 2022. That's a bit dramatic. But when I smelled it, I was like, oh my gosh, this smells so good. First of all, good job, Paris. And second, I looked at the scent notes and it's raspberry bloom, hibiscus, and cherry. All of the things I thought that I didn't like in a fragrance. And this was my favorite one of the month, which just goes to show that, you know what? Maybe we don't know everything. Maybe we don't know our likes as much as we think that they do, and just maybe one month live on the edge and let Scentbird pick it for you, or choose something completely out of the box that you don't know if you like or not, because it just might end up surprising you. And I feel like this is a very, poetic Scentbird moment for us, because this is what Scentbird is all about. Discovering your style, building your collection. It's also a great tool to express yourself through fragrance. Because some days maybe you are feeling a little bit more bitch please, and then the other you're feeling a little bit more Ruby Rush by Paris Hilton. Scentbird lets you figure that out by choosing a new designer fragrance every single month for just $17. Every month you get to decide what you want. They have perfumes, they have colognes, they have lots of unisex options. And with each fragrance, you get a 30-day supply. So that lets you try out fragrances before committing to a full bottle, which I think it's very clear is what I need to do, because I would have just gone rogue and never even give little Paris a chance. It also saves you on a lot of costs because some of the bottles can retail anywhere from $150, $300, even $500. So for $17 a month, you get a very hefty supply. I mean, that is a lot of product. This one is actually the Bentley for men, and I got this one so Big Guy could try one out. And this is perfect for him because he loves having cologne in the car. He always smells divine. So these little to-go Scentbird packets are just perfect for that. If you're really not sure where to start, you can take a simple quiz on Scentbird's website, and based on your answers and the preferences that you give and the previous purchases that you've made, Scentbird will help you find a fragrance that you might like. They carry designer brands like Prada, Gucci, Versace, as well as niche brands like Skylar, Heretic, and Confessions of a Rebel. If you want to check them out, make sure to use my coupon code Sherilyn for 55% off your first month at Scentbird at scentbird.com. Once again, that is Sherilyn for 55% off at scentbird.com, which ends up being just a little bit over $7 for a designer fragrance your first month. They're also available in Canada and the USA, which is amazing. Thank you again so much, Scentbird, for sponsoring today's video. And if you're curious about the scents that I'm using today, those you can also find in the description below. All right, riddle time. I guess these aren't really riddles. It's almost like you're solving a riddle case. Like last week's was really fun. I loved all of your guys' responses, so I wanted something kind of along the lines of solving a crime. All right, today's is: an old man lived alone in a small cottage. One Thursday morning, while the mailman was delivering a letter, he found out that the old man was murdered. He immediately called the cops. When the cops arrived at the scene, they find 2 bottles of milk, Monday's newspaper, a catalog, flyers, and unopened mail. The police find the suspect. Who is the suspect and why? All right, today's case is a Canadian one. I think somebody suggested this to me quite a while ago. I can't find the name, so I'm so sorry, but I did come across this a couple weeks ago and I was like, oh my gosh, how have I not heard about this? I read a book on this case. The name is escaping me right now. I will put it in the description. If I forget that, just let me know. And then I also watched a special on Prime TV on the case, and if you kind of want to hear some recordings and interviews with those involved, I highly recommend checking it out. The case we're talking about today is the murder of a woman named Beverly Lynn Smith. It took place in Raglan, which is near Oshawa in Ontario. When the story took place, this area was known as a rougher part of Ontario. The majority of the people who were living there went by the code of, I'll stick to my business, you stick to yours. Some of the nicknames I came across for Oshawa was the Schwa, the Schwiggity, my favorite Schwallywood, and on a cold December evening in 1974, it was also known as the place where Beverly Lynn Smith was shot in her home. And despite a number of suspects, 3 arrests, the case went cold for 40 years. Beverly was known as one of those girls that everybody loved. She didn't have enemies. She was kind, beautiful, smart. She was born into a family of 4 girls and born Beverly Lynn Brown. In the family, there was the older daughter, Susan. Beverly was a twin with her sister, Barbara. And then there was Wendy. The impression I got was they were soul sisters. Everyone knew not to mess with one of them because they all had each other's back. Specifically the twins, they had this unspoken twin bond. You're best friends for life, and you have the only person in the world who probably will ever really know who you are. One thing that people remember most about Beverly is that she had a very quick wit to her. She was also very artistic and creative. She liked to draw things and she loved to sew. And it was in her mid-teens that she started dating a guy named Doug Smith. The whole family was taken by him. They thought he was a very great match for her. He was funny, he was caring, he was attentive. When they fell in love, they were pretty young. They were 17 years old. But she wanted to get married, do the whole thing, have the house, have the hubs, have the baby. So she convinced her dad to sign for them to get married underage, and she proudly became Mrs. Beverly Lynn Smith. After they got married, they moved to a quaint little house in Raglan. Not long after they moved, they had their first baby, a little girl named Rebecca. Beverly loved being a mom. She was born to be a mom. And even though Beverly and Doug were starting this young little family, they still also, kept in touch with their youth. They loved to host their friends and have them over. Those 70s house party pics from the instant film in people's basements and kitchens and stuff? That was their jam. At the time, they were renting, but they were in the process of getting excited about looking at houses. They wanted to move to an area in Oshawa that was close to the GM General Motors plant because that's where Doug worked. On December 9th, 1974, it was just a regular run-of-the-mill day. Doug said in the morning, Beverly made poached eggs for breakfast. After that, they set off to do some errands. She went to go and grab some fabric for a sewing project. Doug got a case of beer. They also went to go get stamps because she was in the process of filling out all of her Christmas cards. They also drove by to go and take a peek at this house that they wanted to put an offer on. and then they headed home. Doug had a nap because that evening he was working the night shift at General Motors. And he said the last memory that he has of his family is pulling out of the driveway, seeing Beverly in the window, holding Rebecca, and just holding Rebecca's hand, helping her wave goodbye to her dad. It's really a somber moment when you come to think of it, because Beverly really didn't like when he worked the night shift. And now we know that that was the last moment that he would ever see Beverly alive. We know that at 5:43, Doug got to work. Usually when he worked the night shift, Beverly would call one of her sisters and just chat on the phone to keep her company. Beverly did call her twin Barbara to see if she wanted to come by and hang out a little bit, but Barbara already had plans. She had a date to go on that night, so she couldn't go. So Beverly occupied her time and her attention with getting all of her Christmas cards all laid out and set up, and then started working on some sewing projects that she was going to give as gifts at Christmas. Around 8:35, Doug calls Beverly at the house. It was during his break, and that was something he usually did to talk with her because he knew that she was going to be lonely, and she didn't answer, which was very unusual. He gave it a couple more tries, thinking maybe she was just putting the baby down or needing more time to get to the phone, and when she still didn't answer, he started to panic, and he called Beverly and his neighbors who were friends with them, Alan and Lori Smith. They lived across the street from Beverly and Doug with their little baby. Alan worked for the Humane Society, picking up strays that he came across on the road. And that evening, Alan and Linda had just gotten home. Linda had actually tagged along with Alan during the day and went to work with him. They left the Humane Society around 7 p.m., headed home, made dinner. And so they were just settling in for the night when Linda answers this call from Doug, and he's wondering if she's over there visiting. Linda says no, but she said it's no problem at all. I'll run over and check on her and make sure everything's okay. So she just leaves the phone off the hook. This is, the 70s where we don't have our cell phones to just run across the street and to hang up and then try to call him and get the reception to go and flag him down at the workplace. It's not convenient. You just let your phone hang. She gets over to Beverly and Doug's, knocks on the door. There's no answer. So she goes around to the side where the kitchen is, and she peeks in the window and she sees Beverly laying on the ground, and it appears that there's a bunch of blood around her head. She books it back home, picks up the phone, tells Doug he's got to get home now. And hoping she's wrong, she looks at Alan and she says, can you please go over there and see if I'm seeing something and see if she's okay? He goes over, he looks through the window, he sees the same thing that Linda did. So Alan runs back, he tells Linda, call 911. And then to also try to grab attention faster on the chance that there would be like a cruiser driving by or something, Alan goes out to his vehicle and he puts on the flashing lights that he has on his truck for like his Humane Society work van. Pretty quickly, an ambulance arrives. They see Alan frantic outside of Beverly's house. The accounts of what happened next have been inconsistent on multiple parties throughout the years. Alan said that the first responders were trying to kick in the door to get to Beverly, but they couldn't, so he tried and he was able to. Once they get in, they go in, they try to render first aid, and they realize quickly that she was already gone. As people are coming in and out of the house, Alan starts asking, where's the baby? They have a baby. One of the first responders goes in, and in the living room, they find little baby Rebecca in her playpen. She's alive and well. They scoop her up, they give her to Linda, and Linda brings her back to her and Alan's house. Doug pulls up pretty much at the same time, understandably frantic. The police let him know that she's already gone and they need to interview him right away to try to get a jump on solving this. Alan, being the one there on the scene when they arrived and busting down the door, is also asked to go to the station. Alan's asked why he was there at the scene when they arrive, and he just explains that Linda had gone first, asked him to go double check if she was okay. She wasn't, and then he went to go call 911. Linda's also interviewed and corroborates this version of events. And when they speak to Doug, it sounds like he has a pretty solid alibi. He was at work at his job at GM, and one of his coworkers said they vividly remembered speaking to him on the line and as well as on their coffee break. When they spoke to family and friends, one of her sisters says that they were on the phone till about 7 p.m. After that, no one had spoken to Beverly, but according to everybody who knew her, Beverly always locked her doors, especially when she was home alone. And there is no way that she would open the door for just anybody unless she knew them. During the investigation of the crime scene, there's not really anything on the surface that's calling out to them. It doesn't look like a robbery. The kitchen doesn't even look like anybody's ever even had a meal in it. It is just beautifully kept until you look down and you see Beverly there. But there was no struggle. Nothing was thrown about. There was no sign of sexual assault either. When she was taken to the medical examiner, it was clear that she was shot in the back of the head. And it looks like whoever did it when her back was turned and she never even saw it coming. They did find remains of a bullet. It was quite destroyed, but the ballistic test suggested that it came from a Cooey Model 22. I am no gun expert, but I guess this is an easily accessible gun, or was at the time, and is one of the most affordable. Another thing that stood out to them in this clean, very well organized kitchen was a bag of pot. As they're going up through the house, they get to this spare bedroom. And in the bedroom, they find some more pot. It's about an ounce worth, and it's all prepackaged in separate bags, indicating that you're probably going to sell it. Police asked Doug about it, and initially he denies that he sells any drugs. But when they start talking to more people who know him, that is not the word on the streets. The word on the streets is that he is known for having drugs in his house and dabbling with the dealing on the side. Beverly's twin sister seemed to be one of the people who knew most about it, and she said that Beverly had opened up about how uncomfortable it made her and how she really didn't like it, and she was just trying to work with Doug to, get him to that same conclusion and get him to stop. Finally, Doug comes clean to the investigators and he's like, yeah, okay, I dabble in dealing. The reason he wanted to bring it up and have them know about it is that he said he recently bought a pound, sold some of it, but there was about 6 ounces missing now since her death. He said the only person that he knew of that was expected to go to the house that day to pick up, but as far as he knew he didn't, was this 18-year-old, a guy named Mark. Mark was pretty much buying his supply off Doug and then selling it to the high school kids. Mark was interviewed. He admitted to the police that he did go to the house. He went to buy a half a pound, but when he got there, he was short money. So he said, I'll go home, get that, come back. But allegedly, he never made it back that night. And that's pretty much where he was left off. He was a suspect at one point, but never pursued. Another guy who was investigated involving perhaps this drug dealing gone wrong was a guy named Doug Daigle. So while Mark was buying from Beverly's Doug Smith was buying from Doug Daigle. And the word on the street was that the night of Beverly's death, Doug Daigle went to Doug Smith's to collect a debt. That's a lot of D's in that sentence. And this guy is said to be quite a loose cannon. He was a heavy dabbler in PCP, and he was known for acting very erratically when he was on the drug, doing things that were reckless, and then say that he didn't remember it because he was stoned. He even was quoted as saying by someone, on the grapevine sharing stories about Doug with the investigators that he didn't know if he did that. He said, I could have done it. I could have shot her, but I don't remember because I was stoned. Again, that's just kind of where things stayed with him. The rumor mill just kept turning with a lot of different suspects, which is common in these cases. At one point, it does come out that Doug Smith, Beverly's husband, had been confronted by her for having an affair with a young lady. Beverly found out and was naturally and very understandably upset, and it caused a lot of tension and arguments in their relationship at that time. As more people were getting involved in the investigation, there were some people that came forward that worked with Doug that said that they saw him jump a fence after punching in at work. Ultimately, though, Doug was investigated and cleared of any suspicion. Beverly's family also agreed that yes, Doug was not perfect, who is at that age, but they don't believe that he would have ever taken Beverly's life. And from that point, time just stood still, and her family was distraught because there was no answers. The more they thought about it, there's really no motive that anybody could think of. Everybody loved Beverly, so the idea was that somebody just maybe randomly broke in and shot her. And over the years, as you're thinking about, okay, who could have done this, it just starts to take a toll. They started suspecting everybody. They're looking at strangers on the street, wondering if it could be them, maybe even the cashier who's checking them out at the store. As the years are going by, specifically Beverly's twin sister, Barbara, really couldn't let it go. She had been haunted by Beverly's death because she said that the moment that she now knows Beverly died, she had this awful pain in her head that evening. She didn't know what it was. She couldn't explain it. It came out of nowhere. And then when she finds out that her sister has been murdered and she was shot in the head, she was like, that that was the moment that she left. And that just gave me the chills watching her in this one documentary that I watched. She also said this thing that really touched me, struck me, made me super emotional. She was like, anytime I want to remember her, all I have to do is just look in a mirror and there she is. And oh my God, very powerful. Over the years, Barbara did try to move forward, not move on as best she could, especially for Beverly's daughter, Rebecca. She wanted to be extremely involved and present in her life, which she was. And then one day through the years, she said, okay, enough is enough. We are solving this. And they thought they were really close to getting answers in 1988 when Doug Daigle was arrested for her murder, but then just as quickly, it went nowhere. There wasn't enough evidence and no charges were laid. I guess at the time of Beverly's murder, he was living in an apartment building that wasn't too far away. And so when the word came out that there was suspicion on him that he went over to the Smith's house that evening, one of his neighbors was questioned, and she said that she remembered going up there to hang out with him around 5:30 and then staying until around midnight, which means that he wouldn't have been able to do it. It's worth noting that she was re-interviewed quite a few years later, and she said she didn't remember giving that statement in 1988. There was actually never even a signed confession by her. It was just a written out confession from one of the investigators saying that he was just reiterating what she was saying, and she never signed it. She also didn't think it really made sense to hang out with him from 5:30 until around midnight because she had children, and she was like, I would have never left them in the apartment alone that long. Allegedly, his father also owned multiple guns, and one of them was a Cooey. After his release, though, again, everything just went to a standstill. The case went cold. The family did as best as they could to move forward, but Barbara still was just really struggling to fully get there. It ultimately got to the point where she took it upon herself, like the badass B as in Barbara, that she is, and she went to the police station, stormed in, and was like, I need to speak to the chief. She marched in and was pretty much like, you know what, this needs to be solved. We're going to need to reopen and start reinvestigating. Stat. Luckily for her, by this point, it was pretty much a whole new team and department. So they agreed to reopen her case in 2007. They went from the very beginning of everything, looked into all of the suspects from the initial investigation, interviewed over 200 witnesses, got DNA from people, took fingerprints, and one by one they started clearing everybody's name until they got to a suspect that hadn't even been on anybody's radar, Alan Smith, Doug and Beverly's neighbor. Now, in 1974, when detectives got to the scene, they noticed that the door was kicked in. And at the time, Alan says, yeah, that was me. I wanted to help get them in, and the first responders couldn't get it kicked in. Then in 1988, when everyone was kind of re-interviewed again, focusing more on Doug Daigle, Alan was also re-interviewed. And when they read back his statement saying that he was the one that kicked it in, he stopped them and said, wait a minute, I don't remember saying that. And if I did say that, I want it retracted because I'm pretty sure it was the ambulance responders that kicked the door in. So in 2007, the new investigators look at this as an inconsistency in his statement, and it's a red flag. They ask him to come in for another interview, and they also ask him to take a polygraph, which he's on board with. He's like, absolutely, anything that you need to help. I want to help Beverly. I want to help her family. I'll do whatever I need. So he does the polygraph, and the polygrapher comes back and he said, I have looked at the results long and hard, and I have come to the conclusion that you shot Beverly. And in the interview, Alan literally laughs. He's like, oh, okay, you're messing with me. And the polygrapher's like, no, bro, you did this. And he is like, I am not lying about anything. I did not kill her. I hate guns. I had no reason to get a gun and just go and hurt her. He cuts the interview off. He's able to leave because there's not enough evidence. But they did want to re-interview Linda and also give her a polygraph. At this point, Linda and Alan are no longer married. She agrees to come down though, and the question she was asked was, did you shoot Beverly? She says no. And then they asked if she knew who did shoot Beverly. Again, she says no. The same polygrapher comes back though, and he says, you showed deception. She also is like, what do you mean? This is ridiculous. I know nothing. She admits to them that her life with Al wasn't perfect. They both had dabbled in drugs in their life, especially at that era, but it didn't make them bad people who would murder their neighbor and friend. friend. At this point in Linda's life, she had changed her life drastically. She found God. She was clean. And even though she had left Al in the 90s and didn't really know too much of what he was up to, she insisted that both of them weren't killers. I got the impression that Linda was very much a people pleaser. She didn't want to say or do the right thing, the wrong thing. She wanted to do the right thing. And so at this time in her life, she had moved in with a friend who she looked up to a lot. This woman had a very strong sense of God, which Linda admired and wanted to be around her as much as she could, have that rub off on her a little bit. So after the interview, she goes back to her house that she's living at with her friend, and she's like distraught about the whole thing. She doesn't understand how she could have failed it. And this friend got her thinking, well, maybe you're just not remembering something that you suppressed from that evening. Maybe you know something, but you don't want to hurt Alan or his reputation. So Linda starts thinking, oh, okay, is there something I don't remember? It was so long ago. I remember going to work with him that day, but was it a different day? And I got my days mixed up. Her friend's name is Janet, by the way. Janet tells her, I think you are. I think you have forgotten about something. And maybe you've even just put a block up, because maybe you even were witness to something horrible. And if you don't have this block up, you wouldn't be able to cope. And Linda starts believing that. Investigators also interviewed more of their friends now, and somebody came forward who was a friend of Al's named Dave. And he said on the night of Beverly's murder, he called Al to buy some pot off of him. And Al said, I don't have any, but my neighbor across the street does. He said he'd pop over and grab some, and then he assumed that he did because Dave came over to Al's later and he grabbed some pot from him. So the detectives tell Linda, your husband's friend says that he was in the house that night. And according to Doug's statement in 1974, there was weed missing. They believe that he went to Beverly and Doug's house, wanted to steal the pot from him. When Beverly had her back turned in the kitchen, Al shot her and stole the weed. So the detectives go back to Linda with this, and she's like, I don't remember any of this happening, but I mean, it could make sense, and I must have blocked this out. So with that, they go to Alan's house and they arrest him. Not only that, but then they turn around and they arrest Linda for obstruction. They interview them separately in different rooms, and they're like, okay, the gig's up. It's time to confess. Alan just straight up stands up in the room and lays down on the ground and is like, I'm not doing this. You're not going to bully me and pressure me to give you a confession to something I didn't do. I'm going to bed right here. Linda, on the other hand, is hammered for 9 hours straight and changes her story. She says that now she remembers a call came through that night. Al took it. It was a friend looking for pot. He left their house to go over to Beverly and Doug's, and from there, she doesn't know what happened. They ask her, okay, well, did you by chance maybe see him leave with a gun? And she says, yes. She said she saw him have a gun in his hands in the driveway, and he opened up the car door and put it under the car seat. That's all they needed. With that, he was charged with second-degree murder, and now Linda's charges were dropped. Things went even a step further when Linda returns back to the house that she shares with Janet, tells her what just happened. And then Janet said in her own words, she felt like she could help because she had a way of bringing things out of people. She said as they were talking that night, she finally got Linda to admit that she was actually there with Alan the night that Beverly was killed and that he used a rifle. Immediately, Janet calls the detectives and she's like, I have got all the details you need from Linda. They wired Janet up, got her to get Linda to tell the story again, and then Linda's called in again to strengthen the case against Alan. She now says that the night that Beverly was murdered, Al went to go get the pot. She felt like he was taking a really long time over there, and initially she suspected that maybe something was going on between the two of them, so she went over. When she got there, all of the doors were locked, so she went around to go and look in one of the windows. She saw Alan by the table and she just freaked out. This time her story about where the gun was changed, though. She believed that Alan took the gun and threw it in this lake that was by his job at the Humane Society. They ask her if she can take them to the scene, and she says yes. And when they get there, she has no idea where it could be. It's a parking lot. There's no lake, and she says that it doesn't look the same as it used to. So they bring her back to the station again. I mean, we are on multiple interviews, hours and hours and hours of questioning. At one point, she says that when she saw Alan through the window standing in the kitchen, she saw a rifle that was up against the door. She grabbed it and that she shot Beverly. So the detective was like, Linda, what are you saying? You said at first Alan had the gun. Now it's you. Are you covering for him? Is he covering for you? What's the deal? And she just straight out says she's trying to come up with conclusions that will help them. But at this point, she doesn't even know what's real anymore and she doesn't know what's going on. So now she is charged for real this time with obstruction. Her state is so bad that she ends up in a psychiatric hospital. And while there, Janet thinks that it's a good idea to become, one of the boys, one of the team members of this investigation. She gets wired up again and goes and visits Linda at the hospital. And as if Linda's not already going through it, Janet tells her, if you want God and me as your friend and your rock, you need to come clean. Toots. Linda says, okay, Alan did it. She said they both got home from his shift at the Humane Society. Not long after they arrived home, he got a call from his friend Dave, who wanted pot. Al goes over to Doug's with a gun for reasons she can't explain. She's freaking out, so she follows him. She is the one who knocks on the door. Beverly sees them, opens it up. They are chatting a little bit. She turns around, walks them to the kitchen where Al goes to get the weed. She says there was a conflict that she can't remember anything about, but Linda turned around and ran away, leaving Alan in the house. And when she got home, that's when Doug called to check in on Beverly. And from there, she maintained the version of events that she had with her very first statement, where she said that she would go and check on Bev. And this is when she saw her on the floor with blood all around her. By this point, though, there were so many different versions that Linda had given, and it was clear that that would be used as a strong defense. And so they didn't have enough to prosecute and move forward. So after Al being in jail for 4 months already, he was released, which I can't even imagine how that felt for Beverly's family, because it's like over 30 years, you're at this point where you finally think that you have answers, and then it's just ripped away from you. They also felt very much in the dark because they didn't know like all of these different versions of events. So they're like, okay, well, there's a confession, his wife is saying this, but didn't know that at one point she had even implicated herself. Even Al's friend Dave's timeline was all out of sorts. He thought that when he first approached Al about getting pot off of him, it was on a Wednesday. His process through that was that he remembered it being on a Wednesday because he wanted it for the weekend, but Beverly was killed on a Monday. Linda's polygraphs were also very questionable because they told her that she was deceptive, but the responses that she gave, one was, do you know who shot Beverly Smith? She said no, and that was the truth. The second was, did you shoot Beverly Smith? And she said no, and that was deceptive, which makes no sense because if she did it, she would have known who did it. So Alan is released and he emotionally is going through it. He's kind of reflecting on the fact that he's living this life that he had not hoped. When he was younger, he had these big dreams and goals for himself. He wanted to run his own construction company so, he could be the boss and not answer to everybody. He also wanted to have enough money to build this cottage and buy a boat and just be very far away from people. And all he wanted to do was just fish all day long. I know right now my dad is listening to this and his ears are just perked up because this is like his dream scenario. Like my dad, Alan really found joy in fishing. So after his release, even though he's feeling, down and in his place where things weren't the best, all of a sudden he's like, oh, I think things are turning around. One afternoon, he gets this knock on his door and it's this like door-to-door contest. And the first place prize was this fishing trip with all of these goodies. So Alan, does this contest, kind of forgets about it, and then gets a call that he won. So he goes on this fishing trip and meets a bunch of guys that are, very like-minded and have the same interests, and they just all want to be out there fishing. And on the trip, he meets this guy named Danny. Also, at this point in Al's life, he really doesn't have many friends. He had struggled with alcohol and drugs in his life, which didn't always bring out the best in him. He was kind of recluse. He felt like he had failed in his marriages, didn't have money, didn't have confidence to build friendships, just got out of jail, what could he offer? And for the most part, he generally pushed people away, but there was something about Danny, he really just clicked with him. And he was really excited that finally he found somebody who was just as passionate about fishing and camping as he was. And they became really fast friends. Professionally, Danny was a carpenter who also moonlighted as a pot dealer. Another tick for Alan because he did love some Mary Jane. As their friendship is building, Danny introduces Alan to another friend that he might jive with. His name's Jack. And Jack is described as this like almost like a mob boss. He was big time in the drug world, you know, had multiple houses, cars, the works. And Danny said that he did some work for him on the side just to make a few bucks here and there. And he slowly started letting Alan come along with him to do the same. So this goes on for about like 4 months. They're building this trust with Jack. It's June 2009. Alan's hanging out more, feeling like, you know, he's making friends. He's one of the guys. And so they start to kind of graduate to bigger tasks. And one afternoon, Jack gives Danny and Al this sawed-off shotgun and a hearty bag of drugs, like $90,000 worth. And so they go and they do this deal and everything goes okay. So then they got called to do another deal. And the job was that Danny and Al were going to deliver drugs to somebody who was buying another hefty load. And then after the deal was done and they got the money, they were going to go back and take the drugs from them and bring it back to Jack. So they did the deal. They go in and bring 40 pounds of pot to this guy, take his money. A couple minutes later, they go back to this hotel where this all went down and they steal the drugs back. They think everything's going smooth. And then later that night, Danny gets a call from Jack and he has to round Al up and go and meet him. The only thing he says on the phone is, something's gone on and you need to bring fresh clothes with you. So when they get there, Jack is just covered in blood. He tells the guys, this guy who they just ripped off, found out that Jack was behind it, wasn't happy, came to confront him, and ultimately Jack shot him 2 times. Then quickly, Danny and Al realize that they're not just there to bring him fresh clothes, but he also tells them, you guys need to go and get rid of this body. The 2 of them are just tripping, but do as they're told because they think they're going to be next. Alan's just like, this is not what I signed up for. I just want to be home. Danny's like, it's okay. We're going to get this done. And then all we have to do is just go meet up with him, tell him it's done, and we can walk away. So they do. They dispose of this body. When they go back to meet up with Jack to let him know that everything is done, Jack's like, this is just not going to work for me. You have something huge on me. I just murdered a guy and I have nothing on you. You're not leaving here until I can fully feel like I trust you. So the guys are just sitting there and then Alan just says, all right, something I've never told you is I was in on a murder. His story is that he went to his neighbor's house with a friend of his named Dave, who was the one that implicated him in the 2nd-degree murder charge. And the plan was to rob his neighbor of his pot. Al said that he ran up to get the pot, and when he came down, he saw Beverly run towards the kitchen, and Dave shot her in the back of the head with a .22. Even though it doesn't really implicate him, Jack's like, okay, well, I guess that's something that I've got on you. So they leave, but when they leave, he tells Danny, I was not there for the murder. I just wanted us to get out of there. Everything seems to be okay for a few months, but then Jack calls and gets everybody to go in a meeting again. And he says, you know, I'm just, as the time is going on, I am just spiraling here, feeling very vulnerable. He's like, I don't really feel like I have anything on you because you said you were there, but it was another guy who did this. Alan says like about 9 times, you know, I'm sorry. I actually don't really have anything for you because not only was I not there that night when she was shot, like this guy didn't do it either. I was just so scared for my life that I made the whole thing up. Then Danny pipes up and he says, you know, I think Al was just scared to fully give you something because he's worried you might turn on him. Jack says, no, I'm the one that's scared. And then at this point, Alan says, okay, I killed her. He says he went to the house. Beverly let him in because they were neighbors and friends. He said at one point she walked to the kitchen to go and get the baby's bottle and he followed her and shot her from behind and that was it. His words to Jack were, from that day forward, I just played dumb. Jack seems satisfied with the exchange and he lets Alan and Danny go. Before they leave, he says, okay, well, we'll be in touch before Christmas so that I can give you guys some money for helping me out. As they drive away, Alan says to Danny, you know, I'm out. I don't even want a few bucks here and there from the pot deals with him. Like, I don't want anything to do with this. He also does say, though, that, you know, talking about the murder and sharing that made him feel better. Danny asks why he did it, and Al says because he heard that Beverly was going to tell Linda about a girl that he was seeing who happened to be friends with Beverly's sister, and he didn't want to risk losing his wife and family. So fast forward to the next meeting with Jack. It's December 10th, 2009, and they're meeting up to get paid. They are expected to each get $2,000. And Jack rolls up. He's like, oh, I'm Santa Jack here. Here you go. And he leaves. So they're each handed these fat envelopes. When they open it up, it's just a bunch of paper. All of a sudden, they are surrounded and these sirens are going off. They're arrested and the police look at Danny and they're like, you're arrested with criminal negligence, and they look at Alan and then they're like, you're arrested for first-degree murder. When they get to the station, they're in the same holding cell, and Alan's kind of trying to talk Danny down, just be like, this is what's going to happen. They're going to take you here. They're probably going to separate us. Like, everything's going to be okay. And as they're talking, Jack walks by and he's like, hey boys, just so you know, I am a undercover detective. He says, I just want you to know that there was no murder. So this body that you thought you buried, you don't have to have that on your, weighing on your heart and your conscience. Conscience. He said it was just a mannequin that was just wrapped up in a tarp, and then there was sheep's blood that was used for effect on the tarp and all over him when they got there, and he was covered in blood. So he's like, so, like you guys don't have to, go to bed thinking that you did this. It was just fakes. And they're like, oh, okay, well, thanks. After he gets arrested, Alan calls his lawyer and he's like, I did not do this. Not only did I not do this, but now I've got like my best buddy, Danny, who I finally found after all these years, and he didn't do this either. And his lawyer's surprised. He's like, who's Danny? For all the Friends fans out there, instantly just went to Rachel when she like fogged the Yeti. She's like, I did not fog Danny. Who's Danny? I really need to come up with a different comfort show, don't I? So Alan's like, Danny is my best friend. I just met him a few months ago fishing, and he's caught up in all of this too. Turns out, though, his best friend Danny was also an undercover agent. His lawyer's like, okay, well, this is a really tough spot to be in because you have confessed. Every time that he met up with Danny and with Jack, they were mic'd up. Every conversation they had was recorded. And so his lawyer knows that if those tapes become admissible in court, no one's going to believe that he's innocent, because why would you confess? So they motion to have the tapes excluded out of evidence. They go to pretrial in March 2011. The argument was that they tried to put pressure on Alan, and when it wasn't working and they were trying to pull information out of him as his friend, they still weren't getting what they needed. So they had to do something so extreme, and the pressure was just like too much, involving him in this like murder cover up. And then he's like so scared for his own life that he just was put on the spot to make up a story to save his own butt. In their mind, they believed that this was a form of coercion. At pretrial, they played all of the audio. There was over 1,500 hours. And in all of the audio, it's not until he is backed into this corner that he admits that he's guilty. There was a conversation that he did have with Danny at one point where he admits that he had just recently been released from jail, and admits to Danny, that the police think that I killed my neighbor. But he repeatedly tells him, I never could, I never did, and that his story from the get-go, the same one that Linda initially also told, was the truth. The defense argued that they just completely broke him down mentally. He got to the point where he was just so scared that he was also going to be killed or something was going to happen to his family. By this point, Danny had even infiltrated his family and become, close with them. So he just did what he needed to do. After the arguments, the judge comes back and says there are so many holes in his confession. His words were actually that a Mack truck could drive through the holes. He also felt that what the undercover officers did with this whole operation was abuse of power and authority. Because of that, the confessions were inadmissible at trial. Again, understandably, there's so many emotions on both sides. You've got Alan's family, who is elated because they believe he's innocent, and then you've got Beverly's, who are devastated, after hearing the tapes and hearing his words, especially when he said, that he felt better after confessing that final time. Why wouldn't you feel like he did it? So at this point, he was in jail until July 2014, which was 5 years. after being arrested. And after the judge ruled that the tapes were going to be inadmissible, the case imploded and he was released on bail. Days later, the prosecution made a statement that they weren't going to go forward with the charges at that time because there was not enough evidence. And now again, this is where everything is left off. And I can't imagine like what an emotional roller coaster this has been for Beverly's family. They just keep thinking that they're getting closer to justice and then it just completely gets ripped away from them. I just kept thinking about Beverly's daughter who has no memories of her mom. She was so little and she's just kind of been left to live this life of fighting for her. Also, when you're being told, you know, by authorities that this is what it is, we believe that. Why wouldn't you? But I guess as an outsider looking in, I don't even know how many cases at this point that I've seen like the most head shaking actions and outcomes where they don't always get it right. And not to purposely, you know, ruin a family's life, but it happens. What got me on the fence about this case is that after Alan finally confessed to Jack and Danny in the car ride after, Alan does say, you know, well, I guess you guys have me by the you know what now, but that he did, you know, feel this sense of relief for confessing. He had already told Danny before after he left that he had made up the whole version, so I don't know why he didn't do the same that time. He said he just wanted to be done with it all. He gave what he felt like they both needed and played it out. So I don't know. I'm so frustrated. I feel like I can see every side here. All around, it's so infuriating because it's just such a senseless murder. This beautiful, innocent, young, loving mother, wife, sister, friend, daughter, she's just gone forever. For what? Ever since this case though, the sting operation that took place here that happened with Alan, it's known as a Mr. Big Sting. It's known to be very deceitful. It's actually not even allowed in the USA or the UK. And then after Alan's case, new guidelines were set that are very strict. So unless they meet all of the criteria and then they stay within these ethical boundaries and limitations, if they were to get a confession and then they didn't check all those boxes, it's not admissible in court. I've just been racking my brain about, you know, okay, like what more can be done? It's been 48 years and Beverly's family still don't have answers. My thoughts are just, you know, maybe with continued attention and pressure, something can be done. Maybe there's somebody out there who knows something and has been too scared to talk about it. But now with all of these years passing, they might feel safer. I think it's fair to say that she most likely knew who did it because there was no signs of a struggle or break-in. At the end of the day, whether she knew this person or not, they're not being held accountable. You know, someone did this to her. I get really frustrated with unsolved cases because I just want to find the answers for the family. And I don't always do them often because I do like a conclusion and feeling like there's some sort of justice, but they are important to share because it's, you know, by continuing to talk about it and keeping it in the public that it, you know, elevates its chances of being solved. You never know who could come across this and be like, oh, okay, I remember something. And that's my hope. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. That is it for me today, though. Thank you for watching. I love and I appreciate you so much. The answer to today's riddle. Just a quick reminder. An old man lived alone in a small cottage. One Thursday morning, while the mailman was delivering a letter, he found out that the old man was murdered. He immediately called the cops. When the cops arrived at the scene, they find 2 bottles of milk, Monday's newspaper, a catalog, flyers, and unopened mail. The police find the suspect. Who is the suspect and why? And the answer is the suspect is the newspaper boy, because Tuesdays and Wednesdays newspapers were missing, so obviously he knew there was no point to deliver them because the guy wasn't going to read them. All right, I'll see you in the next video. I will miss you terribly. Until then, make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon.